I'd like to welcome you back after the break. I'm Diana Morris, and I am Dean of Instruction at College of Menominee Nation, as well as affiliate faculty with the Sustainable Development Institute. I'll be facilitating this session, and if you look at your program, it's Sustaining Rights, Resources, and Economic Development. Our first speaker is Monisha Gangopadhyay. Not too bad, eh, Monisha? She has a master's degree in environmental management from the Yale School of Forestry, and prior to that, she was an environmental reporter in Bangladesh, and that's where she was introduced and worked with the community that she will be presenting on. Please welcome Monisha.
Good afternoon. So the title of my presentation is slightly different from what it says in the conference booklet. In the conference booklet, it says that my presentation is on the story behind the loss of indigenous ecological knowledge in India's most species-rich state, Meghalaya. And I will be talking about this story, except since I handed in my abstract, I've expanded indigenous ecological knowledge to include also indigenous assets for survival. And also I wanted to take a moment to sort of locate myself in this presentation. Standing before you is an Indian American presenting a topic about quote-unquote Indians from India before an audience partly comprised of American Indians. How many of you have seen the blockbuster Hollywood movie, Good Will Hunting? Some people? Okay. So then maybe this will be somewhat familiar to you. The people who I'm going to be talking about are Indians of the dot and the feather. And this has some significance in this presentation. Oh, there we go. Okay, so just to locate everybody in this presentation, I conducted research in Meghalaya, which is one of the most species-rich states in all of India, according to the World Wildlife Federation. And, I don't know if I can do this. Ooh, can you see that? Okay, let's see. It's located right here. And it's basically located in the infamously neglected northeastern region of India, which is surrounded by 5 other countries, Nepal, Bhutan, China, Burma, and Bangladesh. And this has a lot of implications in terms of the culture and the livelihood practices and the ethnicity of the people who inhabit the northeastern region. They are mostly tribal communities, and they are ethnically, religiously, and culturally distinct from Indians of the mainland. And they are also geographically isolated from the mainland. The Northeast is connected to the mainland by a corridor that is merely 20 kilometers in length, or 20 kilometers wide. And this has implications on the policies, which primarily come from the mainland and are imposed on the Northeast. My research site was the Garo Hills, which is on the the western end of Meghalaya right here. Ooh, jeez. The western end of Meghalaya right here. Okay. I'm still trying to figure this out. And Meghalaya, as I said, is one of the most species-rich areas in all of India. It has over 110 mammal species, 450 species of birds, 265 species of orchids, and several tree genera, including the pitcher plant, which is endemic to Meghalaya. Other vegetation are the sal trees, teak trees, which are commercially viable, medicinal plants, and some wild animals, which are listed here, including tigers and monkeys. But the key species that is targeted for conservation is the Asian elephant. And that is also the target of the conservation organization that hosted me, Samrakshan, which is based in Bagmara, the district headquarters of South Garo Hills. And you'll see here why it's so important. Almost the entire, this is the South Garo Hills district of Meghalaya, and almost the entire district is a conservation landscape. I don't know if you can see there, the numbered villages they're called Achicks. Those are where people live. But the majority of landscape is characterized by national parks and reserve forests, namely the Balpakram National Park and the Bagmar Reserve Forest. Together, they are the largest contiguous habitat in Meghalaya that has the best long-term possibility for conservation of wildlife in general, and the Asian elephant in particular. However, the livelihood practiced in the Garo Hills, swidden cultivation, which is widely practiced throughout the Northeast. And this agricultural practice is also something that makes the Garos distinct from agriculturalists in India. Agriculture is a pretty large part of the Indian economy. However, in the rest of India, plow cultivation dominates. And this is another thing that sort of makes the Garo Hills in the Northeast distinct. It is also one of the reasons why the policies have sort of marginalized these communities. Again, the predominant community in the Garo Hills, they're called the Achicks. They're commonly called the Garos, but it's the origin of the term Garo is sort of nebulous, and Achick is sort of preferred. And they predominantly rely on swidden cultivation. The landscape is characterized by montane slopes, and it's largely forested. And typically, I just wanted to take a moment to describe swidden cultivation. I know the last speaker sort of talked about it a little bit. But it's widely practiced in forested areas, and it's historically been practiced in temperate regions, though today it's more widely associated with tropical climates. It's practiced in other parts of South Asia, not in India, and also in the Brazilian Amazon and Peruvian Amazon, as well as Borneo and Indonesia, among other areas. So this region sort of has more similarities with other parts of the world than it does with India. And to describe swidden cultivation is basically selecting a large tract of forested area, cutting down the vegetation, and then leaving the vegetation out to dry under the sun. In the Garo Hills, this is done at the end of the winter season in February. And once the vegetation is dried, it's burned, and the ashes that remain fertilize the soil. And this is very important for a region that is characterized by montane landscapes and monsoon climates, because during the monsoon season, when this region experiences torrential rains, the rains sort of hit the slopes and wash away the topsoil, which is rich with soil nutrients, and bring them down to the plains, leaving these areas sort of depleted of soil nutrients. And swidden cultivation allows people here to cultivate on this land and make it arable for agriculture. So then I guess what happens is the land is cultivated for about a year or two, after which it's left fallow for several years. Another characteristic of swidden cultivation is that it involves intercropping. So the way this has sort of been practiced in the Garo Hills is that in Aching, or a village, almost the entire community is based in one little hamlet or githam. And land use is decided communally. Once a year, the community gets together with the Nokma, or the village headman, and they decide which plot of land within their village they will cultivate. And basically, the entire community lives in the githam, and then there's a jhum land away from the githam. Jhum is also another word for swidden cultivation. And surrounding these two areas is forest. It's predominantly a forested landscape, which is what has allowed policymakers to create these forest reserves, because they existed in the first place. And some things that sort of characterize this sort of system are traditional laws that protect the ecology of the region, such as keeping forest reserves and replanting trees in these forest reserves that do not get cultivated at all. Also, communal help in terms of looking out for wildlife, marauding elephants and wild pigs. This sort of happens in rotation within the community, as well as certain kinds of discipline, which is sort of reinforced before burning. This community will clean the boundaries of the cultivated land so that the fire does not spread across beyond the boundaries. Another sort of characteristic of this sort of system is knowledge sharing within the community. And these are all threatened by policies, Indian policies that create reserves and promote cash crop farming in an effort to sort of decline the importance of swidden cultivation. The primary crops that are grown here are rice, which is a staple, as well as potatoes, tapioca, maize, millet, yam, and leafy greens, not all of which are indigenous to this area. Some of them were brought over by British colonizers. And in the last 10 to 20 years, the harvest from swidden cultivation has lasted for about a year or two, but in recent times, productivity has declined to 1 to 6 months, and this has obviously had some impact on the livelihoods here. Swidden cultivation, despite what policymakers believe and despite policies in the region, recent ecological discourse sort of supports the value of swidden cultivation for an ecosystem. Because in swidden cultivation, farmed land is abandoned and left fallow, and allows for primary and secondary successional forests to grow. It's not a permanent deforestation, but rather it allows for forest regeneration, unlike other forms of agriculture like plow cultivation or permanent agriculture. The growth of new forest is essential for soil fertility. It also allows for new plants to grow that have low-hanging leaves, which are beneficial for herbivores that feed off of them. Without this, the landscape would consist entirely of mature forests that would be inaccessible to all the varied wildlife that we see in Meghalaya, including many of the species that I mentioned earlier. Also, as I mentioned, unlike plow cultivation, which is more dominant in India and throughout the world, swidden cultivation allows for a dynamic ecosystem and a process of forest regeneration. Further, swidden cultivation involves intercropping, which is better for biodiversity, and also intercropping is more resistant to pests and other invasive species. And there are a number of influential stakeholders that have sort of tried to influence the dominance of swidden cultivation in the region, beginning with the British colonial administration down to current government policymakers, funders, external funders, one of which is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that funds the NGO that that hosted my research, and Christian missionaries who have discouraged traditional practices and discouraged harvest festivals and wine drinking that are essential to reinforcing social bonds that are part of the indigenous assets for survival that I'll talk more about later. And so the primary policies are to reserve forests and to promote cash crop farming. And the goal is to prevent deforestation and protect wildlife habitat. And I basically went to 3 different Achicks in the South Garo Hills, and I looked at how indigenous assets for survival differed among the elders and the youth, and among those who lived in market towns versus those who lived in subsistence villages. And I was able to gain a lot from this. The 3 villages that I studied in were Hangsapal, Gongrod, and Rewak. Hangsapal was a great can someone tell me how much time I have? I know I have a lot of material. Okay, thank you. So Hangsapal is a very remote village that is far from road access, and it's characterized by steep slopes. And 100% of the villagers in Hangsapal engage in swidden cultivation. Rewak is in the opposite end of the spectrum. It's a market town which lies directly off the road. And because half of Rewak's land has been sold off to the wildlife department, only 5% of the villagers here still continue to practice swidden cultivation. The rest practice wet paddy rice cultivation and other livelihood practices such as government service jobs, building these roads, building infrastructure there. Rewak, unlike most subsistence communities or most villages around this area, has access to electricity. There are also you see many more people engaged in service in the service industry, such as being teachers and pastors and the like. And the majority of households in all three villages engage in a mixture of livelihood practices, which include shifting subsistence farming, cash crop farming, livestock. It also includes selling baskets and winnows made from bamboo, and also recently many people have started engaging in coal mining. So the policy of cash crop farming was triggered by various departments of the government: the Soil Conservation Department, the Wildlife Trust of India, the Forest Department, the Rubber Department, which has distributed rubber seeds. And it's also been triggered by an interest amongst swidden cultivators to enhance their livelihoods. And the primary cash crops that are grown are plantation crops such as cashew, as well as rubber, and also horticultural crops such as pineapple and oranges. And one of the main characteristics of these policies is that they separate people from nature, and I guess it sort of denies the fact that the reality that people and their livelihood practices are an integral part of the ecosystem, as I mentioned earlier. Also, these policies sort of see markets as a solution for livelihood problems. And this is problematic because in reality, as I mentioned earlier, the Northeast is, the market linkages between India and the Northeast are very weak, and the landscape is characterized by a tortuous montane landscape, which makes it difficult for road infrastructure to develop. And so these market solutions are not exactly meeting up to the needs of the people in this region. So the problem here is that, the fact is that swidden cultivation and indigenous knowledge, as well as indigenous assets for survival, are embedded in the landscape and are embedded in swidden cultivation. And on the other hand, there are NGOs. There are NGOs and funders and government bodies that are imposing conservation initiatives on this environment, on this ecosystem, and on these people, but they're not informed by that ecosystem or the context within which the policies are being implemented. So what's missing is the science based on this context, and also the indigenous knowledge and the assets for survival that are based in this context. And this is problematic because swidden cultivation and indigenous assets rely on and reinforce ecosystem health. Without them, ecosystems decline and livelihoods also deteriorate. The problem is that policymakers are looking externally for solutions rather than internally. And this is not happening in a vacuum. There are broader socio-cultural reasons for this. There's a long history of marginalization of indigenous communities in the Northeast that began with the British colonial administration that viewed swidden as destructive and wasteful, and the people who practice this as wild and backwards. People who have studied indigenous communities elsewhere may relate to this. And there's also a paternalistic attitude that people are incapable of knowing what's good for them. One British administrator, this is just one of many, said at one of the forestry conferences as early as 1874 that the way out is to reserve large areas and prohibit jhum. Efforts should be made to change people to permanent agriculture. And this legacy continues in mainland India. By people who had once been colonized are now, I think someone earlier had mentioned how we are still colonized in our mindset. And these notions that these British colonizers sort of left behind, they left behind a legacy of that perpetuates internalized notions that were laid down by colonial predecessors. And these notions prevail in a context where the influential centers lie in the mainland political structure in Delhi, and which is known for the promotion of certain Hinduized and nationally unified identity. So the northeastern communities, who are ethnically and religiously and culturally different from Indians in the mainland, and agriculturally distinct from Indians in the mainland, are perceived to be not well integrated into the economic and educational system. They don't fit into the national image, and they are also cast as wild backwards. And so what happens is these policies sort of continue to support market-oriented livelihoods. They move away from subsistence farming, and the assets that are tied to it, such as the independence from the market, communal cooperation, traditional practice and laws that protect the environment, and they move towards sort of a livelihood that is separate from the ecosystem and actually degrades the ecosystem. Maybe I should spend a little time explaining this. What I mean by independence from the market, people who practice shifting cultivation actually use resources from their environment, such as bamboo to make baskets and mats and winnows, such as gourds to carry water rather than steel jugs, which have to be bought from the marketplace. Even something typical of a monsoon area, umbrellas are made from surrounding vegetation. Where now you'll see in the market towns, everyone carries, the kind of umbrellas that maybe we would carry, plastics made from synthetic materials, again, bought from the market at exorbitant prices. And this is significant because, market fluctuations are great in a place that is so remote. And so this shift away from using natural resources is detrimental to this community. Also, with communal cooperation, with cash crop farming, I apologize. This is part of a much larger thesis, and I'm having a little bit of trouble to condense it. But with cash crop farming implies a shift from land tenure practices, which are communally decided, to privately owned land. And so, whereas before I had a picture of the entire community staying in one githam and farming it in one area, today those people have had to move away from the githam and move towards other areas of the Achicks, basically deforesting land that would have had a chance to regenerate if it was jhumed instead of cash cropped. What happens is there's sort of this implies a shift in communal structures and cultural structures as well. Land use is not decided communally anymore, and people are more oriented towards sort of market-oriented interactions. And so, whereas before there was a system of you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours, now we see more people working on other people's farms for agricultural wages. And so there is not this sense of communal, cooperation, and this is very much felt by the elders of the community. Furthermore, traditional practices such as reserving forests are not practiced anymore, as well as not farming near streams. That is also not adhered to. Fire management practices are also not adhered to as much anymore. I guess these are some of the indigenous assets for survival that I was referring to. They include social bonds and self-governance, natural resource management and utilization, and these are important for the community in terms of natural resource management, in terms of livelihoods, in terms of reinforcing social bonds that are important for the community to thrive. These are all deteriorating as there has been a shift from subsistence livelihoods to market-oriented livelihoods. And it's promoted by this system of forest reserves and the promotion of horticulture and plantations. What is happening at the same time is population growth and timber logging, as well as the ban of traditional festivals and the drinking of rice wine, and the change in land tenure practices. So whereas we once had an Aching that looked like this, it now looks like this, or rather this. And it seems that this policy has most greatly requires the most sacrifices of those who are most vulnerable to the policies and who have traditionally contributed to the ecosystem, while it benefits others who are becoming wealthy off of degrading the environment. Timber logging has increasingly become a problem as land tenure practices are sort of taken away from the community, as land use of these villages have been taken away from the community and have been carved out into reserves that are hard to monitor. And so we see an increase in timber logging, which has degraded the environment significantly and not at all achieved the goals of the policies that are implemented in this area. And this is just a picture of what a jhum field looks like. Most of the vegetation has been cut down. This is a temporary house in that area. Okay, I've mentioned a lot of these before. So it affects the land tenure and community structure. 50 years ago, there was communal decision-making that reinforced cooperation, knowledge sharing, and passing of age-old traditions. Today, we have increased private land ownership and a decline in communal decision-making, a spread of satellite hamlets, and a decline in the authority of the village leader. We also have an effect on the ecology, which I'll talk about a little bit more. It involves permanent deforestation. Any kind of agriculture that is not swidden agriculture that is now practiced today will permanently alter the landscape because it is not abandoned. It is unlikely that someone who plants a cash crop orchard will want to abandon something that is economically viable for them, so that they can regenerate forests, other kinds of trees. Also, it involves a permanent obstruction of elephant migratory routes, despite what the motivation behind cash crop farming and these policies. And it has been found by wildlife biologists in the area that there has been an increased incidence of straying elephants to cash crop fields, although elephants don't eat cash crops. So it hasn't at all promoted any of these goals of wildlife conservation. And as one of the elders noted, this phenomenon, basically, he said, before elephants obeyed men, now elephants do not obey men, and men do not obey men either. So he's basically remarking on the increased incidence of elephants coming in contact with humans on their land. On their land that they cultivated. Also, the effect on the economy, the returns of cash crops have not met expectations, largely because of indirect market linkages, but also because of poor yields. Cash crops are not as resilient as swidden crops in a monsoon climate, where characterized by torrential rains, and because they are monocultures, they're not as resistant to disease. In one of the villages that villages where I interviewed, there were these orchard plantations that took several years to grow, and then I think about 5 years to grow, and then they yielded oranges for about 3 years. And then in 1991, there was a big storm that destroyed many of these crops, and also it introduced some kind of infestation. The people there say it was a worm infestation, and it devastated the entire plantation, including those crops that grew around the orange crops. And this is sort of indicative of a monoculture plantation, and it hurt these people dramatically. There are also, what's going on is that these people are also more susceptible to marauding wildlife, like wild pigs and elephants, because they're now living in separate areas and have these private lands and cannot communally sort of help each other. They can't, before, whereas in a swidden cultivation plot, families were allotted plots according to their family size, but they were all right next to each other, and people could help each other out. Now people are geographically isolated, and also are, not the communal bonds have deteriorated because of the lack of social networking and the lack of these harvest festivals that used to be a part of the community, an integral part of the community. And this is something that's very much felt by the elders. Also, there's an increased reliance on market conditions. These people are selling their crops to intermediaries, and they're not getting the best prices for their crops. And it's also, cash crop farming also involves a decline in the portfolio of livelihood practices. When a person moves out to plant an orchard, they cannot carry their livestock with them because, traditionally when people lived in a community and farmed elsewhere, they could keep their livestock where they lived. Now that they are living where they're farming, they can't bring their livestock with them because the pigs and other livestock will eat their crops, and so these are livestock is an integral part of many subsistence communities, as maybe many of you have witnessed. In times of hardship, a pig can be sold, chickens can be sold to pay for fees for schooling, for someone who is suffering from ill health. So I've already mentioned a lot of these before. Elders perceive a decline in yield, and they attribute it to the loss of faith in their traditional gods. Whether this is true or not, it is true that traditional practices to protect the ecology are declining, and there is a lack of communal help. And something else, there's a loss of happiness. Elders are sort of reminisce these days that I sort of mentioned, where there was this communal helping, and there were these festivals that reinforced these bonds. Let's see. And they also, criticize the youth for being increasingly dependent on the market. They say this generation never learned how to make anything for themselves. So jhum, or swidden cultivation, is central to the livelihoods here and has contributed to the dynamic ecological equilibrium. So in engaging in jhumias, or people who engage in swidden cultivation, are engaged in an ecological process of which they need to be attuned to cycles of seasons, soil fertility, wildlife habitation. And I mean, there's a lot of literature out there talking about why indigenous knowledge is important. One of the eminent scholars in this area is James Scott, who happens to be the head of the Agrarian Studies Department at Yale, and he talks about IK in terms of métis, which represents a wide array of practical skills and acquired intelligence in responding to a constantly changing natural and human environment. I would add to these skills cultural attributes, which also arise out of necessity, and become assets for survival. I guess there's so much more to say, but I guess what I would recommend to government policy makers, as well as the NGO that hosted me, and which continues to sort of impose their own policies on these people without being informed by the local indigenous knowledge and science that's based on this area, is that the process of attaining livelihood enhancement and wildlife protection is just as important as the goal. And what is needed is context-based programs, which will be more successful than programs from the outside. I mean, livelihood matters above all else in this area, and those who deal with day-to-day complexities will probably have a more utilitarian set of assets and knowledge to handle their livelihood needs other than outside programming. Although there is a need for some kind of collaboration, as of yet, there is no forum for this collaboration to happen, or this feedback mechanism to happen. I'll read this paragraph to you. When I first went to Garo Hills, I was excited about learning about indigenous ecological knowledge. I imagined taking interviews, voraciously writing insights from the local community. Sure, these moments came in bits and spurts, more heavily at the end after I developed a foundation for understanding the dynamics of the lives and livelihoods and the sets of challenges people faced here. The real assets in this community have evolved over several centuries, and understanding their value is a slower process than what can be learned through books or interviews. Outsiders may be quick to apply what seems apropos in an impoverished subsistence agricultural setting. However, each setting comes with a unique set of attributes and a motif that has allowed these communities to thrive and survive in their specific contexts. I did not fully appreciate the value of these assets until well after my field research ended. After poring through my notes and extensively surveying the literature, cooperation, communal decision-making, festivals, wine drinking, playing of traditional instruments, traditional medicine, these are not just cultural attributes, but they are also assets, albeit non-monetizable, for survival. Not just for the people, but also for the ecosystem within which they live. So I'll reiterate, as I have done so many times before, what is required then are policies that are informed by a combination of context-specific science and indigenous knowledge and indigenous attributes to enhance jhum productivity and to introduce technologies or agricultural methods that are informed by and address context-specific ecology. And this is a treehouse that is a lookout point for marauding elephants, and I just wanted to sort of leave you with that, with a picture of a jhum field in the middle of summer. And I want to thank these people for supporting my research, as well as the College of Menominee Nation and the Sharing Indigenous Wisdom Conference, and all of you for being patient and listening to this story that I had to tell. Thank you.